back to the Washington Outsider Report on the Coalition Radio. For those newly joining the program, my name is Irina Zuckerman, and I'm the editor-in-chief of the Washington Outsider. With us today is Dr. Yaniv Roznai, who is an associate professor and vice dean at the Harry Radzyner Law School and co-director at the Rubinstein Center for Constitutional Challenges at the Reichman University. We are here to discuss a fraught topic, a poorly understood topic, and a topic filled with controversies and challenges and nuances that often create a rift between Israeli and American audiences, which is Israel's relationship with democracy, which is in itself a broad topic, but of course, current political challenges, accusations against the Netanyahu government, and assorted social and popular tensions have contributed to this topic looming ever larger on the minds of Israel and its supporters. Thank you so much for joining us today to clarify this subject that can be a little bit complicated to unravel. So just to get started, could you tell us a little bit about your work at the center, and how do you view quote unquote constitutional challenges, given that Israel does not in fact have a formalized constitution, which in fact has been part of the issue to begin with?
Yeah, so in 2022, Professor Liav and we established this center. Originally, we thought of constitutional crisis, a research center that would focus on constitutional crisis. We then opted for constitutional challenges, which seemed a bit broader and also maybe more optimistic. Challenges are also opportunities, etc. And unfortunately, the constitutional crisis in Israel arrived sooner than we imagined. Studying democratic erosion processes around the world, we've realized that the constitutional crisis will arrive to Israel. But then, really soon after the establishment of our center, the new government in Israel was established, December 22. And then in January 2023, the Minister of Justice proposed his big proposal of judicial overhaul. And then, as you're all familiar with, an unprecedented protest movement arrived to counter that judicial overhaul. And the crisis that we envision, I mean, we envision when we established the center, we had in mind five mega constitutional crises that, in a way, challenge our constitutional democracies all around the world, by the way. It's not something that is unique to Israel. Uh, so security crisis following September 11 onwards, the migration crisis, the financial crisis and inequality, so economic crisis and inequality in a way, the rise of populism and polarization,
Mhm.
and the rise of radical movements and challenges to democracy because of new technologies. So this is what we've had in mind, and in the center we are dealing basically with all of these type of crises or challenges in a way. Um, so that's the brief story of the center. And I want to maybe answer briefly your remark on the fact that Israel lacks a constitution. Uh, and I'm not sure that I totally accept that presupposition. Of course, Israel has a constitution in the substantive sense that we have laws that regulate the relationship between governmental branches and between the government and the citizens, but also in the formal sense. Israel has a series of basic laws. Well, Israel lacks one document entitled the Constitution, but we
Mhm.
do have a series of basic laws that carry the title of basic laws, and they basically function as our constitution. So they regulate all the institutions of government, and they regulate human rights, and they are superior to ordinary laws. So if there is an ordinary law of parliament that would violate these basic laws, then this law would be deemed unconstitutional, and our court can declare it as unconstitutional and strike it down. So in many ways, we nowadays have a formal constitution, basically since the mid 1990s, since the constitutional revolution of the mid 1990s. But it is still, uh, in a way, a constitution that is partial. It is not complete yet. It lacks various chapters. And it is a very, very flexible constitution. So it lacks the rigidity that many constitutions around the world have. So just to give you an example, if tomorrow I would want to enact a basic law, Queen Irina, and nominate you as our Queen of Israel, I can do that in one day in a simple majority in Parliament, just like as we enact any other law. So for American audience, it would seem very bizarre because if the US Constitution is probably the most rigid constitution in the world, almost impossible to amend, the Israeli Constitution is probably the most flexible one in the world. Very easy to amend. Simple majority, no limits whatsoever. So that's our story.
So how does that impact the political arguments and the legal arguments concerning the nature of Israel's dedication to the rule of law if the constitution is so easy to change?
It undermines the very idea of constitutionalism, and it creates certain uncertainty and also illegitimacy because every majority that is in power can basically use its majority to completely change the rules of the game. And that's part of the problem. So when the current government achieved its 64 Knesset members out of 120, basically it could do anything it wants without any limitations, and because it has the majority. So with that majority, the Knesset can change the basic law on the judiciary. It can abolish basic law human dignity, and this is highly problematic. Therefore, one of the elements that is most needed now in Israel, and what we've learned in the last 2 years, that is basically essential to this stabilization of Israeli democracy is, let's say, basic law, what we call basic law legislation, that very basic law that would once and for all regulate how you enact the basic law, how you amend the basic law. That very chapter that is missing in our constitutional order that would stabilize the rules of the political game. We are now lacking of such a chapter in our constitution, and that is very bad for all our institutions because it undermines the complete legitimacy in all our governmental institutions.
Has there been any efforts to change this constitutional format? And given that everybody who is in politics benefits from the status quo, I imagine that the incentive is not all that particularly great. And how does all of this also fit into Israel political system, which in itself is poorly understood outside the country?
That's a terrific point, Irina, because that's precisely it. I think proposals to enact this chapter of basic law legislation and to finalize our constitutional project has been proposed, in the last 70 years. And more precisely, since 1975, there are concrete proposals of basic law legislation, but this has never been fulfilled, precisely because, as you mentioned, no one within the political game has an incentive to enact something that would limit their own powers. So we're in a kind of a vicious circle here, and the effect of the political arena has been quite problematic because I think you mentioned our democratic system that it's very hard to understand it from the outside. You need to understand how peculiar our system is compared to any other democracies in the world. So it's not just that we are lacking any rigid constitution, right? And just so you can understand, in Israel in the last decade, there were more constitutional amendments than in the entire US history, okay, in the last decade. So it's not only that, but we are also very bizarre in the sense that all other democracies in the world have various mechanisms to make sure that political power is not centralized with one body. This could be two chambers or two houses in parliament. This could be a presidential system with certain veto to the president vis-a-vis the legislator. This could be constituencies, so some kind of a regional element. So if I'm the representative of Bristol in the parliament, I represent other interests. Um, this could be, for example, subordination to certain supranational institution or organization like the EU or the European Court of Human Rights. Uh, uh, this could be a federal system, like in the US or Canada or Germany or Australia, where you have this vertical separation of powers between the central government and the states. Israel is the only democracy in the world without any of these mechanisms. So it's a unitary system with a government that basically controls the legislator and through coalition discipline can do whatever it wants. And those who rule the coalition are five or six politicians, the leaders of the coalition parties. So we have a very bizarre system. And not only with that, but we vote in what we call uh, a closed ballot. So, for example, if I vote for the Likud, I only put one vote, Likud. That's it. I cannot affect the list of nominees. I cannot say, oh, Irina is a terrific politician. I want to rank her higher than other ones. No. So the accountability of the legislators is not towards the electorate. There is a complete detachment between we, the voters, and and those whom we elect. So those people now in parliament basically owe their responsibility, accountability to the politicians who had the parties, who lead the parties, not to the voters. Half of the people now who sit in the Israeli parliament, okay, in the Israeli Knesset, there's 120. Half of them were selected by a single person, one person, the leader of the party, who selected them. Half of the people now in parliament. So we are lacking, I think, very important democratic institutions and mechanisms that exist in other places. And if that's not enough, add to that the fact that we have a very, very slim Bill of Rights. In any other normal democracy, of course, modern democracies, you have elaborated bills of rights with, you know, lots of 35 in average, but in modern bills of rights, 50 rights, rights of the man and women, rights who are being protected in the constitutional document. Israel only has 11 rights explicitly protected in the basic laws and crucial rights such as equality, such as free speech, such as freedom of religion, right to education are not expressly protected in the basic laws. Now, it is true that our Supreme Court, being quite strong, has been protecting elements of these rights through its judgments or interpretation to human dignity.
Hmm.
But that is not enough because this is just an interpretation that can change. Just like in the US, right? The right to abortion was recognized once and then not. But moreover, it just fuels the populist rhetoric of, aha, look at these left-wing liberal judges who impose upon us rights that we don't want. So basically, the Israeli system is extremely behind when it comes to its, let's say, constitutional and democratic setting.
So what recourse do the regular voters have, given that A, unless they're active in the party, they don't really have a real say in politics, and B, given that there is this disconnect between the ruling bodies and the protection of basic political rights, who if they have to rely on these quasi-formalized institutional checks and balances that are quite controversial in the way they're enacted, is there a real dedication to the rule of law, given that the rule of law is basically in the hands of political parties and not outside bodies that are basically um, enabled and empowered to protect them?
So your question, I think, is the best explanation why we have such a strong Attorney General office and Supreme Court. Because we are lacking political institutions of checks and balances,
Mm-hmm.
most of the, let's say, heavy weighting of protecting democracy then falls on the, let's say, legal and judicial bodies. So the Attorney General is an independent body, a professional independent body, and is extremely, I think, strong in a comparative perspective. The Attorney General's advice, legal advice, are binding upon the government. And we have a Supreme Court that is also independent and very strong. It can exercise strong judicial review. It can even strike down basic laws if they violate the core values of the state as Jewish and democratic. Uh, and it is these two organs that protect Israeli rule of law. But in a different manner, I think what you've just raised also explains why we've seen such major civic protestations all around the country in the last 2 years because the people feel, if they want to change something and the political avenues are quite limited, then they go to the streets and protest in the streets. But I think it actually points to a very strong, notion of rule of law and democracy within the civil society and within the citizens. Uh, I think Israel has been experiencing in the last year or 2 years some kind of a constitutional moment where there is mass mobilization of people who speak about democracy and rights and judicial independence and separation of powers, which is a good thing.
So, in other words, if the government wanted to prevent these mass demonstrations, the legitimate way to do that would be to create political avenues for action, so that the people wanting to challenge the political system could do so through representatives, through whatever it is that is generally done, local action, grassroots political action. Obviously, that is also not in the interest of the any of the politically active ruling individuals. Is there a structural way for that to happen, given the strong disincentive at top level? Can there be a mass mobilization forcing this sort of change on a lower level until from bottom up it can penetrate the top levels of the political system?
So I've just mentioned this constitutional moment, and we know that major constitutional changes often occur after a crisis. And in the last few years, Israel has been experiencing the most severe political crisis, security crisis, constitutional crisis, in addition, of course, to the health crisis that everyone experienced in the world, and also, the recurring elections that we had. Uh, so I think if there is a time to change, it's now. All the accumulation of these crises will bring about a change because major segments in the political arena, mainly from the opposition, in addition to this pressure from below, from bottom up, from the people, I hope that the next government would be a more moderate and large and broad government that would represent, the vast majorities of Israel. And I hope that in this government, major changes for the benefit of Israeli democracy will be able to be achieved.
There's a lot of discussion about whether or not Israel is acting in a quote-unquote democratic manner, which is increasingly a more difficult question to answer, given that the standard vehicles and mechanisms of democracy are simply not present as a matter of structural issue. To what extent, however, is there an understanding of what democracy is and should be versus adaptation of elements of democracy that are convenient to any given political faction or movement?
That's a terrific question. I think that there is a debate, or at least, let's say, an argument within Israeli society among those who regard democracy in a very substantive and broad sense, so that it includes minority rights, various principles such as separation of powers and the rule of law, etc., vis-a-vis other segments of the society that take a very narrow and formal understanding, both of democracy. Okay, democracy is the elections,
Mhm.
formal democracy, and also of the rule of law. So rule of law is what the law says. And if we can change the law, that would be manifestation of the rule of law. And I think there's a clash between these two visions in our society nowadays. And you can see it now in in the coalition versus opposition and the judicial, those who support the judicial overhaul and those who oppose it. So there's a clash between these two conceptions of democracy in Israel.
How would you say who is leading in that clash, and what is it for an outsider? What should we understand about the direction this is going? Because I'm seeing whenever American jurists or just regular American Jewish leaders, community leaders trying to engage on these topics, they always end up talking past each other, and there's this generic understanding that Israel is democratic, it's more free than its Arab neighbors, and so on and so forth, and of course freedom of speech. But if there's no real protection for the media, if the media is not very vigorous, if the media itself is not really serving its role, if there's no protections for various things, if there's a very populist approach to democracy, does it really enjoy the same protections as a country with a more formalized code of democratic institutions? In other words, is are we seeing the civil society, are we seeing the institutionalism of democracy the same way?
I think what I need to put to make things clear here, of course, compared to our neighbors, Israel is a thriving democracy. Not that it's very difficult, right? It's quite a
Mhm,
low standard. Uh, but still, I need to, we are not in any way an autocratic country. The media is still very strong and independent, and you would hear criticism
mhm,
of, let's say, Benjamin Netanyahu and the ruling party every day on many
mhm,
channels. We have very thriving civil society with human rights organizations. Uh, and you see the protests, but not only that, you see these human rights organizations very active, also in litigation and in
mhm,
promoting democratic literacy. Of course, they're under stress, and of course, they're under attack. The media, the opposition, civil society, etc. Of course, like any other populist government, our populist government is also attempting to silence and limit criticism and various restrictions on its powers. But Israel is still, let's say, a militant democracy in that sense, trying to fight against. And look, um, our Supreme Court strike down the one amendment that was enacted in July 2023 that limited judicial review.
mhm,
Uh, and we had hundreds of thousands of people every week outside in the street, protecting the judiciary, arguing against the reasonableness grounds in administrative review. Where do you have it? Where would you find it? Hundreds of thousands of people for 10 months every week going out the streets to protect judicial independence and argue against changing the way judges are selected. So we still have a very thriving democracy. And of course, you asked about the trajectory. If the current government will continue to stay in power for long and would win the next elections, then the trajectory is very bad towards an illiberal democracy and more. But if this government uh, will be out of power, and as I mentioned earlier, a more let's say mainstream a mainstream government that represents the very majority of Israelis, then we can go forward and promote the the liberal democratic project. You can see in the surveys the vast majorities of Israel they object now Netanyahu, and they object the moves and the maneuvers of the current government. The problem is that we are now lacking various means to take this government down. And this is why you see the protestations. But and Netanyahu knows that, because otherwise he would go for elections after October 7. The reason that Netanyahu is not going for early elections is because that he knows that he doesn't have a majority to form a new government. It is that clear. So there's a certain paradox here. The less public support the current government has, the less incentive the current government has to go for early elections. So this is
mhm.
why they're holding on their powers.
So obviously, if would there be anyone who could hold a majority if the early elections were called today? Because as much as people seem to be united against Netanyahu, I don't see a wide popular support for anyone else.
That is true, and that is why I mean the way that Netanyahu lost the previous time was that several opposition parties have gathered together and joined forces, kind of like what happened now in Poland. You have this anti-populist coalition that is composed of various groups, sometimes totally opposite in terms of ideology, etc. But if this is what is needed, then that will be needed. But I think that the liberal camp, in a way, has been awakening since 2023. Just to give you an example, in our elections, to the Israeli Bar Association, something that no one really cares about usually.
Hmm.
This last year, when this occurred, sorry, 2 years ago in 2023, middle of 2023, thousands of people came to vote and waited for 3 hours in line just to vote for the liberal candidate to be the president of the Israeli Bar Association. So I hope we can gather this kind of energy also in the national elections. But I'm not naive, and I also know that October 7th, in a way, also undermined various liberal votes. And
Hmm.
because eventually, people care about security and their lives more than everything. And if this means to silence free speech, then so be it, for many people. So I'm not saying this is without any challenges. This would be very extremely challenging after October 7. But there is awakening of the liberal camp, and the liberal camp in Israel will fight back.
So we are seeing that the conservative camp in Israel is very much shifting towards this more populist securitization model, which, by the way, is ironic because I'm not entirely sure that the security element has demand that would have justified all of this potentially has been really met. There's a lot of controversy about the security dimension of the Israeli political sphere. How does this, how do you foresee these potential moves in divergent directions and how they will affect the Israeli society, leaving aside Netanyahu and what happens to him?
I think it's a very important point because first, I think we need to understand, unlike many, for example, European countries, where populism arose on various social elements such as demography and migration, these uh, economic inequality, etc. In Israel, it is security-based populism in many sense. So the very fact that we're surrounded by enemies and that there's a clash between the Arab Palestinian minority within Israel and the Jewish majority, then it's very easy to build upon this populist notion of enemy and friend, the Schmittian distinction between enemy and friend when you have real enemy. So the security issue, I think, is crucial uh, for our politics. Okay, it's important to understand, but more, let's say, relevant to the actual events that we see in the last year or two. What happened is it's quite amazing. The judicial overhaul was blocked at the beginning by the protest movement, and then after October 7, everyone thought that this is already behind us. No way that the government will continue with its attempts to undermine the judiciary. Now that we realize the risks, and the government has been dealing with this nonsense, and instead of paying attention to the security issues, uh, and perhaps this notion, or let's say aspiration in a way, uh, it was true for about a few weeks. But then soon after, the government continued with its attempts to undermine the judiciary and the attorney general and the judges. But, and here comes the answer to your question. Now, October 7 and the security crisis has become the excuse to do precisely that. Oh,
Hmm.
look at that. It is the judges and the legal advisors that tie the hands of our soldiers, and they are the ones to blame for October 7. And all the judges are extreme left wing, etc. And they give priority to Palestinian rights over security interests. And this is why we need to have judicial reform. Okay, so now the insecurity has become the excuse to push forward with the judicial overhaul, precisely the one we the government, we started 2 years ago.
So how do the Israeli voters envision any potential changes? What kind of structure would they want to see? Because right now I'm hearing a lot of general dissatisfaction with the fact that the system is so weak and imperfect. But are there any, besides this huge judicial review overhaul, have there been any concrete recent proposals that would have systematically change the entire structure to avoid all of these issues from happening, no matter who's in power?
Yeah, so there are multiple proposals from various actors, such as various research institutions and politicians and NGOs regarding several issues. First, to stabilize the constitutional system by enacting this basic law legislation that would once and for all stabilize everything and would set a very high bar or a more rigid element when enacting or changing basic laws. There is another proposal to complete the Bill of Rights once and for all, to write that everyone are equal and everyone
Mhm.
have free speech, etc. And there are also proposals of changing the electoral system. And what seems to be interesting is that one of the proposals actually arrived from no less than our president of the state, who has no formal role. But in mid of March 2023, in light or against the background of the crisis, has proposed on national TV a constitutional reform of his own. Um and the president has established a website dedicated to this proposal, etc. So there are multiple proposals. And as I've said earlier, I really hope that the next government will be able to push forward with these proposals.
So, what is the direction of these proposals?
The, the,
Of
the
of
direction
these,
of these proposals
yeah.
is more to a more liberal, to
No,
a
no,
more
no. I
liberal.
mean, what is the next step to actually get them enacted? What would be the way to get them passed?
Most of the proposals are already, drafted, they're written, yeah, they're ready to be enacted. What you need is you need a political action vis-a-vis the politicians to convince them to do that. And there is some pressure, I think, from below to do these kind of things. And hopefully, when we can get sooner rather than later to the next Knesset, to the next parliament, to the next government, then these politicians of the liberal camp will be able to push forward with these proposals.
Well, one of the issues you mentioned that's been quite uh, an obstacle, it seems, that is the lack of responsiveness of the parties to the voters themselves, because they're sort of independent bodies that have a lot of wield, a lot of power, and they don't need to respond to anyone who is not already on their list. So the question is there a way to limit the power of the parties themselves?
Yeah, so one of the main proposals in that respect is to move to what we call open ballot,
Mm-hmm.
where you can have some kind of a primaries on the day of the elections, so that you can actually rank the various politicians to whom you vote in the party to whom you vote. And I think there's quite an agreement, even both from the right wing and left wing, that this change is necessary. And this is one of the proposals that one of the even central politicians such as Benny Gantz, who is in the center of the politics in Israel, wants to promote. So I hope this is one of the things that we'll be able to change.
Well, there seems to be a lack of really um of leadership or at the top level from various opposition candidates, which is part of the reason why there is a lack of unity around any particular candidate. Is there any way to overcome this dearth of visionary proposals? Because I haven't heard anything from anybody that would seem to um um mm, mm, that would seem to satisfy the public need for some sort of a grand strategy, a grand political strategy.
Yeah, I think you're right, and that's well, it's not a legal question for me, but it's more I'll just speak as an observer from as a citizen. It seems like that those who object and Netanyahu were unable to push forward with like one major figure
Hmm.
that would gather the public around it. Yet it hasn't happened. We are hearing stories of Bennett, who was former prime minister, who now is going to run. He's probably going to get a lot of votes, but I don't see any one figure that would be a towering figure above everyone. It would probably some kind of a collaboration between various parties from the central left, central right that would have to join forces together in order to win the elections.
Out of curiosity, how do Israelis, or at least informed Israelis, view other democratic models such as the United States or the European Union or United Kingdom? Is there any concrete move to make the Israeli body more like any of these, or is it something completely unique that is being considered?
Could you explain better what do you mean by that?
Well, for instance, the structure of the U.S. Constitution and the tripartite checks and
So
balances.
you mean if there's a certain model that we want
Sure.
to follow?
Yes, emulate.
Ah, I see. Well,
Mm-hmm,
it's a good. Well, traditionally we are based on the British model of parliament sovereignty. This has been our model since the establishment of the state, and in the mid 1990s we've moved to a more constitutional supremacy model. The problem is we haven't followed any other such. We are not a continental system when it comes to our legal tradition, etc. So we cannot copy now the German system or the
mm-hmm,
French system or something like that. Most likely, the we do want to push forward with more, let's say, a rigid constitution like the Canadian style. But the thing I hate most about this is, that whenever we talk about these issues, then people do cherry picking and they take
mm-hmm.
just certain elements from different countries. This is basically what our government did with the judicial overhaul. They said, "Oh, look at how judges are selected in the US. Politicians select the judges. Let's copy the US. And in Canada, there's an override clause. Let's copy the Canadian override clause, etc." I think that we need to look at the things holistically. I can identify various flaws in our legal system, some of which I've mentioned in our talk, and these
Mm-hmm.
are the ones we have to fix. So I don't necessarily think that we need to look at a certain country and say, "Oh, let's take this model," unless we take, the model in its entirely, also with the democratic tradition and culture and etc. And this is things that it's very hard to do. So we have one, people in say, "Oh, we want to be like the Netherlands where there is no constitutional review." Yes, that is true. But but we are not also subordinated to the European Convention on Human Rights and to the Strasbourg. So it's very hard to make these comparisons in that respect. We need to fix the flaws that we have.
So you're basically saying that to avoid this sort of cherry picking that would not really apply well in Israel, you need to be inspired by some unique um, domestic model that's entirely homegrown.
I think so because anyway, our system now is so unique. It's uncomparable to any other system. So, I think I don't think it would just be, useful very much to say, "Oh, let's try to be like New Zealand." We are
Sure.
not like New Zealand. We will never will be.
Has there been an effort to establish some sort of an independent committee that would bring together all these different projects and voices to consider? Because it seems to me like a very disjointed effort right now, and you could indefinitely continue with different think tanks and organizations firing proposals with little popular support or understanding, unless you have a serious body established for that purpose with, merging some sort of a consensus.
So until very recently, no. But
Hmm.
since the judicial overhaul and this constitutional moment, when people understood that there must be some kind of a paradigmatic shift or change,
Sure.
now there are more and more proposals to establish citizens' assemblies and new constituent assemblies and these kind of popular mechanisms. And perhaps one day we'll be able to do that. But this, I think, also opens multiple new questions, such as who is with the people and what do you do with the borders of the state and the
Hmm.
Palestinians. So I'm not sure that even in this crisis, we'll be able to get to such, grander mechanisms of, okay, let's have a new constituent assembly for the state. I think this might take a while. But
Hmm.
but at least the constitutional moment that we've experienced, at least is one movement or one step towards such a major change, something that we
Sure.
haven't experienced in the last 30 years.
Hmm.
And in that respect, and in terms of democratic literacy, that's important.
Would you say that there is a high level of democratic literacy specifically? Or is it being erased by these populist security concerns? Are there people essentially? Is there, in other words, a personality cult for Netanyahu, to put it mildly, that actually, you know, that is actually beyond normal security-minded prioritization, and that actually erases any sort of democratic literacy, regardless of where you stand on any specific political proposal?
I think that we are very much behind in terms of democratic legitimacy. If you look at, the schools, primary schools, I'm not even talking about, ultra-Orthodox schools.
Mm-hmm.
There's a huge emphasis on national elements, on Judaism, etc.,
Mm-hmm.
and not enough on liberal democratic elements, something that we have taken, for granted, unfortunately, for many decades. So I think we have to make a major shift also in our education system to promote liberal values, to promote liberal education. We've began doing that now in the last 2 years more seriously in various circles, but we need to take it much more seriously and to put a lot of efforts, something that the current government has no incentive of doing.
Some argue, especially here in the US, that Israeli institutions, civil society institutions, academia, educational system have been very polarized for a long time, and there's been this radical divide between these religious nationalist organizations and institutions and super left-wing, radically fringe, almost anti-Israel movements that are basically anti-Zionist and anti-military and so on and so forth. Is there a middle ground for a classical liberal education, and who would it come from? Because, as I said, I don't really see any such people in politics.
Yeah, well, first, I think there are some new voices in politics, like Yair Golan, who wants to push, for a more liberal, democratic,
Mm-hmm.
also education and actions. So I won't be too pessimistic on that respect. And also, when it comes to civil society, of course, there are, extreme left-wing organizations, as there are also extreme right-wing organizations. But in between, there are many, many multiple, center left, center right, human rights organizations, policy research centers. Uh, so I would be very careful, trying to make this binary
Mm-hmm.
distinction. It is true that the Israeli society is extremely polarized, uh, but still, there is quite, a huge pluralism element here that we must remember.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you so much for these insights, because I do think that before Americans and others start weighing in on what Israel should or should not be doing, they should at very least understand how things currently stand, what they are, and what the problems actually are. And this is a first step towards understanding. I'm hoping this series of conversations will help bring the discussion closer so that there could be a valuable exchange of ideas and less misunderstandings and miscommunications. Thank you so much for joining us today, and I look
Thank you so
forward
much for the invitation.
to
Hope
looking
to
at
see
your
you
work.
again.
Absolutely, absolutely. Thank you so much. Please stay in touch, and good evening to everyone watching this. We'll be back, of course, next Tuesday night at 9 p.m. The Washington Outsider Report on the Coalition Radio, and thanks for joining us now.
Thank you, Ian.